Verbal tenses. Don't tell stories like a kid. This dignified man is Gottfried Wilhelm von Leibniz, the quintessential European polymath from the 17th century, whose towering intellect was probably only challenged by the great Isaac Newton. Now, he was a very smart man and posed interesting questions. Questions like, why didn't God create the world before he did? Why did he choose to create the world precisely at that time and not 7 or 13 minutes earlier? To which a modern scientist like Stephen Hawking would have replied, well, there was no time to speak of in the first place because time and space started to exist precisely at the Big Bang. Now, we're not going into astrophysics or theology. We're going to concentrate on one particular point, namely that Leibniz presupposed the existence of a time prior to the beginning of the story. In this particular case, the cosmogony. So, in other words, even the creation story started in medias res, which means in the middle of something. And that's interesting because that tells us that the author could have chosen to start the story before he did, and that the hero has a past. He could have been doing something before the action began. Just like God was probably doing something before he chose to, create the universe. So let's look at the Jewish creation story, which is the one that we are more familiar with. Okay, just like in any other story, we have a timeline. And the first thing that we learn is that God said, let there be light. And guess what? There was light. And that was really cool. And then he said, let there be a space within the water and let it separate between water and water. And yes, I know the image depicts Moses parting the waters of the Red Sea. I know, I just like that picture. Anyway, yeah, he said that, and that happened. He said something slightly later. He said, let the waters be concentrated under the skies into one place and let the land appear. And big surprise, it happened. So at this point, God was on a roll and he wouldn't stop saying things and creating things. And again, he said, let the earth generate plants, vegetation that produces seed, fruit trees, etc., etc. So as you can see, there is a pattern here. And the structure is not exactly complex. What we hear is that God said, and then he said, and then he said, and then he said. This is a linear approach to storytelling, which I don't mean any disrespect, is the one that a child will use, okay? That's the way children tell a story. They will say, Jimmy pushed me into the river, and then I said, I'm going to kick your butt, and he said, you're a Nimrod, and I said, what is a Nimrod? And that's how children tell stories. But of course, there are alternatives, so let's explore some of them. This is Gabriel García Márquez, and in 100 Years of Solitude, he created what has been lauded by many critics as one of the most beautiful opening lines in the history of literature. We have seen this in class, but, indulge me. Let's take a fresh look at that opening line. It goes like this. Many years later, as he faced the firing squad, Colonel Aureliano Buendía was to remember that distant afternoon when his father took him to discover ice. We have 3 references there. Many years later, remembered an afternoon, and he discovered ice. So again, just like any other story, we have a timeline. And on this timeline, we have several points of reference. The first one, of course, is present time. We are reading the story, or the narrator is telling us the story, and that takes us back to some unspecific point in the past. We don't know when. He says many years later. Later than after what exactly? We don't know. That's part of the mystery. Anyway, there is a second point of reference there, when we know that Colonel Aureliano Buendia remembers the time when he was a little kid and he was taken to discover ice. Now, if we look at that, we have 4 different points of reference, and yet we don't feel that we've been yanked around. The narrator is not aimlessly jumping back and forth. He does move in time, but it feels natural because that is part of the craft of literature, good literature. All these points of reference make the story complex, rich in detail, and it's never boring. It keeps us engaged. Let's explore a second case. This is Jorge Luis Borges, whom I absolutely adore. And again, he wrote one of those memorable beginnings. It's the first line of the Aleph. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but look at that. That is actually one line. There is a semicolon, so that might be cheating. Anyway, I have highlighted in red all the different verbal tenses that Borges uses. And yes, there is the one piece of information that is relevant. Beatriz Viterbo died. She died. But let's explore what he says after that. He says, I noticed. And then he said, I realized. All right. Okay. Before that, he says, she had never stooped to sentimentality. So that is a point in time prior to her death. And then, of course, he moves on to say that the thing that he noticed is that the universe was already growing away from her. Again, she died, and then right after that, he noticed that, but she had, and the universe was doing this. Again, this is rich, this is nuanced, this is not as predictable as he did this, and then she said, and then he did. All right. Of course, you may be wondering, now, how does this all relate to me? I'm not an author, but we are about to see that it does, and it can affect how you go about telling a story. Let's look at some regular person, an ordinary Joe, someone like this guy. Even this man has stories to tell, and even if it's only about those flip-flops, he could tell us why he's wearing sandals in the middle of a Philadelphia winter. Or I can only assume that, he must have said sometime in his life, he must have said, okay, I remember that when I was a kid, and he will proceed to tell the story. Now we have a timeline, that's his younger self, we have another point of reference, all the usual elements, but he does have a choice to think about the time prior to his childhood, maybe when he was a toddler or a baby, stories that his parents may have lived, or he could refer to what is still ahead of him, his dreams, his potential future. That would make any story slightly more rich in detail, more complex. So let's explore a believable beginning of a story that Jeff could tell us. All right, here we have him again, Jeff, and he goes and says something like this. When I was a kid, I used to think that fame was something that happens to other people. My parents had always told me that blah, blah, blah. Do you see what I'm getting at here? I mean, look at all those tenses. I used to, they had always told me that I would become. This is variety, this is rich, this is interesting. And by the way, it's believable, it's realistic. We do talk like that. This is not pretentious or pompous, and it's certainly no attempt at literature. This is real life, and this is one of the reasons why an advanced learner should be in command of multiple tenses, all right? So let's take it down a notch and let's tell a story that happens every weekend. Someone gets stood up. So we have 2 points in time, all right? From present time, we remember this happened. Exactly when? Here, at this point. What happened? She waited. For whom? for this guy who is chronically late, all right? Now, this is as simple as it gets. One point in time that happened, but later he turned up. So we have 2 points of reference. Unfortunately for this man, things did not have a happy ending because before he turned up, she had left. Okay, yes, she was tired of waiting and she hailed a cab and just got home. Why? She had been waiting for 3 hours, which is a good enough reason, I suppose. So we have 2 pieces of information. She left, he showed up. Now, we can do it in the linear way, the chronological order, like the beginning of the Bible, or we can say by the time he showed up, she had already left, which is slightly more complex. Or we could alternatively say by the time he showed up, she had been waiting for 3 hours. I know this is simple, but this is the hallmark of an advanced speaker. You can choose how you place the elements when you string a sentence together. And yes, by choosing one tense or another, you can actually tell your listener whether the story had a sad ending or it had a happy ending. She had been waiting. Well, she was still waiting when he turned up. Okay? So how does this work? Well, in a way, what happens in your brain is that you conceive of one phrase, who would have thought, and something happens in your brain that triggers off the rest of the sentence. Like in this case, you could say, who would have thought that she was going to be a star? We have 2 different tenses. By the time she showed up, you should say, what? If you cannot think of anything right now, that's a bad sign. Had been waiting, had happened. By the time they showed up, I had already done that. That's the ball game. This time next year, I will have finished the novel that I am writing now. Those are perfect constructions. That is advanced grammar. Remember, it's not all about fancy vocabulary. And you need to be in control of all those different tenses. So we move on to our last example. We have a timeline and we have someone that meets a husband, okay? And then she starts writing and she becomes a star. And she speaks at a press conference and the press conference becomes legendary. So the question is, how do you order those elements? I can suggest a complex, interesting way of arranging these elements, all right? We can start by mentioning that the press conference was legendary. Then we say something about the fact that she spoke at the press conference, how she met her husband, and how she started writing. And of course, she subsequently or eventually became a star. Now, in a press conference that would become legendary, Amy told us about her husband, whom she had met exactly the day before she started work on the screenplay that ultimately turned her into one of the most sought-after creative minds in Hollywood. Now, let that sink in. Look at that. We have all those color-coded chunks to let us know how many different tenses are used in this one sentence. It's just one sentence, remember. This is to me sophistication, all right? Not only accurate vocabulary. And yes, you have many choices and sometimes you can be overwhelmed by the possibilities. You can get option paralysis, but that is the bane of your existence as an advanced speaker. And that is a glorious dilemma, what to say. So remember, you can tell stories like a kid, simple, clean, in chronological order, or you can choose to be slightly more complex and rearrange the elements in a sentence, just like Yoda. I want to believe that you get that pop culture reference. Anyway, as usual, remember, you have many possibilities to choose from. Ultimately, the choice is yours.